and then we're good to go. Give it just a minute.
Are we on, Eileen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, excuse me, folks. Good morning. I'm Harvey Rosenthal, and we're so glad to have you with us this morning. I hope everybody who's listening and watching and everyone you love is or work with or live near are safe and well. And for those of you who are dealing with a tragic loss or suffering, we want you to know that we're with you, as we always are in this community of peer support. I'm Harvey Rosenthal. I'm the CEO of the New York Association of Psych Rehab Services, or NIAPers, and on behalf of the staff and the board, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the final third of our three-part, every Tuesday, half-day, free virtual seminar. Got that all out. Our executive seminar, we've been holding that for 16 years, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but this year we decided to offer these for free on half days because the information we have, we're really delighted to present to you. We hope it provides information and inspiration to you at a time when you're home and this is what you have to do very often. And so we hope this is really meaningful to you. I'm personally very excited about it. For those who don't know, NIAPers has served since 1981 as a change agent. That's always been our intention, to raise the bar for what's possible for people and should be possible from the system that supports them and from governments and policies that are enforced or in place. We are dedicated to improving services, public policies, and social conditions for people with mental health, substance use, and trauma-related challenges, where our focus is on promoting health, wellness, and recovery, full community inclusion, and choice. We're a very unique coalition in that we bring people in recovery like me and our staff, Len and the rest of our staff, and providers, community providers who may or may not be in recovery as part of a coalition that has worked since 1981 to act out that mission. We do that mission, and I'll give you some quick examples these days. We're very big on state and national policy. On the state front, we're very concerned about the spread of the virus in congregate care, congregate care settings, particularly in psych centers and in adult homes and in prisons, for example. And on a national level, we're very concerned about getting the money in COVID-4 to the states, which New York really needs in a very big way. We do a lot of state and national training and TA. It's all gone virtual. A lot of it is going to be on our website. You're certainly welcome to have a look at it. If you're, a lot of our funding is from New York State Office of Mental Health, and if you are licensed and funded in New York, you're eligible for that, but others are as well. We are involved with peer innovations. We created the peer bridger model back in 1994, and right now we're in an all hands on deck effort on the state hospitals to help those folks that are hospitalized there to have that power and personal sort of touch of peer support. Our work has never been more important. That's why we've done all kinds of work in this environment. We started back a month or so ago on a webinar called Tips on Working from Home and Working Virtually and in the Field. We helped launch the Strive for 5 campaign, where folks call 5 people every day for a month, a program that's been picked up by the state of Ohio. We have daily meditations. If you go to our website, Ruth Kalan Wagner is with us today. She does these wonderful 5-minute meditations right on the homepage. Highly recommended. I do breaking news so postings. If you're on our list, you'll get them. Otherwise, you'll see them on the homepage. And there's a lot of news. Most recently is on the virus, for example. We have 3 federal COVID funding related webinars. We've had one for providers, one for beneficiaries, and Len is definitely the host one on Thursday for beneficiaries. I will leave the registration information for that in the chat box before we leave. All of these pieces are on the website, and look for in May, a bit later today, I'll be putting out a list of options for May. This year's seminar, we're in our third day, our final day, but the first 2 days have just been fabulous, and the attendance has been marvelous, 450 or more. But the quality of it, I think, has been particularly marvelous. We've had presentations on leadership from some very seasoned leaders, what it's like to lead in this environment. We've had from Peggy Swarbrick, you know, some material on wellness techniques. We've heard about strategies to attract, retain, and support a quality workforce. We've heard, you know, we had a panel with the commissioner and others talking about New York's response to the crisis. We've had a panel on peer crisis innovations and one on successful value propositions. And again, you'll find them recorded with the PowerPoints on the homepage. Now today is a very special program, and you're going to hear from a number of people, all very special people, as they all are, but I'm particularly excited about this morning, and I'm particularly excited that we'll be able to hear from Pat Deegan and Jim Gavin and Lisa Dixon. I'll tell you more about their presentation, but I'm very excited about it, and I hope that you'll feel the same way as it goes on. We are very lucky because of the relationship we have with Open Minds, that we'll have Drew DiGiovanni, an expert on organizational change and management, who will be working with our own expert on the same, Edie Schwartz. Drew will give a plenary, and then he and Edie will do a breakout. The other breakout is going to be from our longtime friend and collaborator, Eve Addis, on trauma. So I hope you stick around for the whole thing. And again, I'll put in the chat box information. One other thing is a bit later today at 3 o'clock, I'll be a part of a webinar that the National Council has supported called COVID-19 Office Hours, and the title is Leveraging Peer Support Skills in COVID-19. And I'll be doing it with Tom Hill and Joan King of the National Council. It'll be at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, and I'll put the link in the chat box a bit later. It's my great pleasure to introduce my partner, Chief Operating Officer Len Staton.
Thank you, Harvey. I'm excited about this day, and really have been extremely lucky to have the speakers that we have today. So I do want to let people know that CEUs are available for all of the workshops and the plenary today. It's pretty simple. You'll receive a link after today's seminar, and you have 24 hours to complete the evaluation form that comes directly to you. And even people that are not looking for CEUs, you also will receive an evaluation form. Feel free to complete it, as we like to know what you're thinking, and we're always looking for ways to improve what we do. Now, during the session, I encourage everyone to turn their camera off. Highly unlikely that you're going to find yourself on the screen, but if you do, you'll want to make sure that you keep your camera off. And at the conclusion of the opening plenary at 11:30, we will all take a short 15-minute break. And it's during that time that you're going to need to open up the NIAPR's website, the first page, and click onto May 5th, and you'll find your program there and a link to the next room for the 11:45 workshops. So if you want to take the time to do that now, that way it'll be easy for you. We encourage you to do that. And then also, we are using a chat box for the questions that you have. Over the last 2 weeks, we've had a considerable amount of questions, and we want you to feel free to put them in the chat box, and we've been pretty good about answering most of those questions. So, and if we fail to do so, you can always reach Harvey or I, and we can make sure that your question gets answered. And then finally, at 1 o'clock, we will all gather back into the assessing and changing your organizational culture room, where we will hear from Harvey and myself for some closing remarks to the seminar this year. So without further ado, I give you Harvey Rosenthal back.
Thank you, Len. I'm just putting in the information in the chat box for the National Council workshop a bit later today. That is, if I'm capable of typing without a mistake. Okay, so this is a great pleasure for me, particularly. I'm really drawn to this presentation out of what I believe is my own and many people's personal journey and experience of the development of the recovery movement from its origins until today. And I'm just going to get rid of this screen here. Excuse me. There we go. And my first experience with the recovery movement really came in the early 1980s with an immersion into the consumer survivor ex-patient movement through conferences and networks, at Alternatives, at NARPA, the NARPA conference, through my mentor, Ed Knight. I was awestruck and really inspired beyond any expectations. I'd been been a person in recovery, been in a hospital, worked in the state hospital, was the director of a club in Albany Clubhouse program, but going to these conferences was just transformative, as it is for so many. And if you ever go to our NIAPRS conference, which I'm not sure we'll have this year because of the virus, that is a transformative immersion into what we're talking about. But anyway, I was awestruck and inspired by any expectations about the core values that were articulated at that time by heroes, many of whom I had the privilege to work alongside. And the key tenets at that point, if I had to pick one, it was really liberation. Liberation from a dehumanizing, marginalizing, humiliating, and sometimes tragic experience of the mental health system, and especially psychiatry. And I worked in the hospitals. I saw how people were restrained and given needles, and I heard of and knew about shock therapy and other things. And I didn't have that experience with psychiatry, but I knew, I knew it was common for some of those heroes. The key strategies at that time were community organizing and taking of personal power, self and system advocacy, choice, self-determination, self-definition, alternative healing, and most of all, dignity of self. Thereafter, I worked alongside so many others to participate in the rise in the rehabilitation, recovery, and cross-disability human rights and peer support movements. Really the thrill of my life. Throughout it all, and I'll never forget that day and all the time that I've seen and learned from Pat Deegan. Pat Deegan has been one of our guideposts throughout this whole journey from the very beginning. Whether it's, you may have heard of any of these things. I don't want to take all kinds of time. Whether it has to do with the dignity of risk. I talked about dignity. The dignity of risk to give people the right to have their own experience and to succeed or fail and learn, as we all do. Conspiracy of hope. And the story, she gave a speech in Scandinavia, I think it was. And by the way, there are people on this chat box who are from, I want to say, Oregon, Denmark, and Norway. So welcome. And we're so glad to join you. Has to be because of Pat, because NIAPRS is not known in Scandinavia, as far as I know. But she had this speech, The Conspiracy of Hope. It was a seminal speech. Just if you Google it, you'll see more about it. And the Cemetery Project that was giving dignity to people who had died on state hospitals. The move to resilience, the Hearing Voices Initiative, Common Ground, the Recovery Library, and personal medicine. Later, as managed care has become the key funding stream for so many mental health initiatives, we were all worried that recovery would disappear into business and profit calculations of cases over individuals, on medical measures and a focus on compliance, and the HEDIS measures of getting to the doctor and taking medicine. This presentation begins, as so much of our movement has, with Pat Deegan, and the story that she is and has shared and will shape and has shaped. As it peaks, and it'll peak with a look at how the recovery movement that is seen through Pat's eyes has not only shaped modern psychiatry, but the practices of managed care. And it's done so because of the extraordinary relationships and personhood of our partners today, the psychiatrist Dr. Lisa Dixon, and managed care hero, Jim Gavin. So I want to turn it over to Pat. I hope I haven't taken too much time. Pat, I'm looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Harvey. I'm getting ready to share my screen here. Okay. And all right. Hi, folks. I believe you're out there. I cannot see you, but I believe you're out there. The title of my talk today is The Birth, the Death, and the Rebirth of Recovery. And I'm going to be talking to you for about a half hour on this topic. And then I look forward to hearing from Lisa and from Jim Gavin as well. So I'm going to start with by sharing with you the notion that recovery is not a new idea. It's been around for some time. And I'm going to take you back to the beginning, to Worcester State Hospital, 1830, founded by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as an exemplar for the care of people diagnosed with mental illness. The year is 1830. Just to put it in a little context, it's pre-Civil War, and Andrew Jackson is president of the United States, as the asylum is built in 1830 and receives its first patient in 1833. It is the first state-owned and operated asylum in the United States. And its first superintendent was Samuel Woodard, who was superintendent at Worcester State from 1833 to 1846. And it's important because Samuel Woodard would later become the first superintendent of the Association of State Hospital Superintendents, which later became the American Psychiatric Association. And what's fascinating about the early founding of the Worcester Hospital for the Insane was that it was founded for the cure of insanity. And Samuel Woodard, the superintendent, routinely conducted annual studies on people released as recovered from the asylum. And recovery was a word that was alive and well, and in fact represented the goal for care. The method of treatment is quite interesting in these early years. Woodward was a strong advocate for what's called moral treatment, and the tenets of moral treatment include the importance of work, the importance of people being industrious and having some meaning and something to do that contributes, the importance of kindness between patients and kindness between staff serving those patients, and also the importance of non-abusive environments, and also a refusal to use mechanical restraints under moral therapy. Now, the one way that it's pretty impressive even by today's standards, and you'll recognize many of these principles in our modern recovery movement, but we're talking back in the 1830s at this point. Where Woodward exaggerated a little bit was around his overall recovery rates, because remind you, just like today, Samuel Woodard had to report back to the state authorities, especially to the state legislature, in order to secure money. And he wanted to show that the work of the asylum was resulting in the recovery of its patients. And so he did seem, looking back historically, to exaggerate some of the recovery rates, some as high as 80%. Nevertheless, like so many well-intentioned initiatives, when we built beds in the asylum, we filled beds in the asylum. And this is the tragic long-term outcome of institutionalization. If we build the beds, we will fill the beds with socially marginalized and devalued people. It's just the way it works. And you can see by just the sheer growth of this Kirkbride structure, Worcester State Asylum, just how quickly, within a matter of 20 years, less than 20 years, the asylum became larger and larger and larger and more overcrowded. And in this situation of overcrowding, the tenants, the approach of moral treatment, kindness, work, structured leisure activity, all began to be put by the wayside, and that there was no time for moral treatment, no time for real care. And we began to see, through necessity, services shifting to the more custodial model. We had the emergence of all new lexicon of words to describe this phenomena of institutionalization and chronicity. We talked about, for instance, people being basket cases, right? Where they would sit all day weaving baskets, and it became synonymous for meaningless, trivial work for people whose lives are chronic, whose course and destiny is determined by disorder. And so in this environment of overcrowding and the transition to custodial care, there was an increasing sentiment by the late 1840s and 50s that recovery really can't happen. Perhaps it was even a lie to begin with. And so actually the successors of Samuel Woodard, Superintendent John Parks, set out to make a case to prove that recovery could not in fact happen. And so what happened is that in 1881, after Samuel Woodard had left, John Parks came in and he surveyed 211 patients who'd been discharged as recovered through 1840 under Samuel Woodard's tenure. He received 94 responses, which is a pretty good response rate in the follow-up study at a rate of 44% of respondents, and found that 51% of those discharged as recovered prior to 1840, prior to when we had psychiatric medications in our modern sense of the word, prior to that, 51% of those discharged as recovered remained well and did not return to the hospital. Pleased with these findings, Parks and his successor, Superintendent Eastman, continued into a follow-up study, looking at another decade worth of discharges. What happened to the people discharged as recovered on their only admission and on their last admission? Again, they collected follow-up data on over 1,000 people. They were not able to find any data on 173 people. So the total number of people in the study was 984 people discharged as recovered. And what they found was that 317 people were well, had never returned to the hospital, and were alive at the time of reply, as long as 40 years after discharge. 251 people remained well throughout their lives, but weren't alive to complete the survey. The families did. So the total number of people who remained well after discharge were 568 people. 41 were lost to suicide, and 375 relapsed at least once. Some remained in family care, even though they relapsed, and never returned to the asylum, and some did return to the hospital. And what this leaves us with was that 568 people out of a total of 984 remained well for the rest of their lives, and the recovery rate during this rather rigorous follow-up study was 58%. Pretty good by even today's standards, right? But here's what the fascinating part becomes, is that John Parks, the superintendent, interpreted the results when reporting back to the Massachusetts State Legislature, summarized the results as follows: there can be no doubt that the public have been hitherto widely misled as to the meaning of the word recovery as used in the hospital reports and as to the permanency of cures from insanity. Not a small number of patients who were discharged recovered in earlier reports of this hospital have many times since become a burden to the public or private purse by reason of a return of the malady. And so when I first read this, I went, my gosh, I thought those studies looked pretty good. Those outcomes, recovery outcomes, look pretty darn good. But here the spin is recovery doesn't happen. Recovery is really not real. And I think the nail went into the recovery coffin when New York's own Dr. John Chapin of the Willard Asylum in 1877, I think captured the sentiment of the fledgling, nascent field of psychiatry, which was now emerging on its own, saying that the majority of the insane are likely to, and as a matter of fact, do not recover. In the judgment of the medical profession, further advance in our knowledge of the pathology of the structural changes of the brain is best assured in the revelations which the microscope will furnish. And this, my friends, is when the idea of recovery was dying and it was being forgotten. During a period of massive overcrowding, human warehousing in gigantic institutions, when all we could offer was custodial care, when the ideals of work and leisure and kindness and an absence of mechanical restraints, when the idea of recovery had been abandoned because were not able to scale the moral treatment and intervention. What happened is that the superintendents who led the institutions began to believe that the answers were to be found in and through a microscope. And when that occurred, for all intents and purposes, was when recovery died. So while looking into the microscope, continued conditions within the asylum began to continue to deteriorate as the numbers of people being served continued to increase exponentially, decade after decade after decade. And when there is this belief that there is only chronicity, an occasional remission, but there is no recovery. The expectation becomes a life of chronic illness, and all we can do is provide custodial care until the cure is revealed through the microscope. And it was a dark and I think very, very troubling a time, and it didn't just last for a decade, it lasted for over 100 years, where hundreds of thousands of people were hospitalized and many died and lived out their lives in these settings. And throughout this period of time, you know, pretty much from the 1850s all the way through the 1960s, we're talking about, you know, a time when there were good people working in these asylums. And I've heard many stories of heroic efforts to break through the despair and the dehumanization and to bring joy into the lives of people. There always were good people. But at a time of overcrowding, where just the whole model was failing, it was not enough, a single effort of good people. So for me, when I look at this image of what it must have been like in these places with the sinks lined up in this way, it gets me thinking about human dignity. And I wanted to read you something about what happens when you live a life, you're considered chronic, and that you there is no hope for any kind of future. So I asked myself, you know, what is dignity? What does it really mean? And of course, the dictionary tells us that dignity comes from the Latin dignus, and it has to do with our value and worth. But it's not the kind of value or worth that goes with having an expensive car or being a famous person or the like. These things are really not what dignity is about. Instead, our dignity is rooted in two things: our being and our becoming. That's the roots of our dignity. So dignity, we have dignity precisely because I am, because you are, that being itself is of value, is of worth. That dignity is not something we have to earn. It is, if you will, a birthright. But importantly, dignity is also about becoming. Dignity is about the freedom to become and to fulfill our human potential. Dignity is about the freedom to be incurably, unapologetically who we are, the unique, never to be repeated gift that we are. And those of us with psychiatric disorders do not have to earn our dignity. The starting point of all mental health and rehab services is for peers and professionals to meet on the common ground of our shared humanity. That's where everything starts, on the common ground of our shared humanity. And that is, in fact, our shared dignity. That through care, I can embrace your dignity, and together we can move forward with services. These images of overcrowding in this period of time where dignity was under assault, privacy is under assault. And for me, this image just says it all, of the assault on human dignity that were part and parcel of this era of care, or the lack of care, actually. And so when dignity is violated in these small ways and in very large ways, when our dignity as human being is violated, there's a universal response. And that universal response is what I call the scream. The scream. And that scream may be muffled. And that scream of, it can be pushed down into a pillow to muffle it, but yet it remains a universal language. It's the language of a million muffled cries pressed into pillows, choked back down our throats for fear that we are going to explode. That scream is the universal language of dignity asserting itself. Stop. Stop. I am a person. I am a person, right? It's a protest, that scream. It's a rage. It's the expression of our agony. It is our voice. It is the cry of dignity itself that rises up when dignity has been violated. And when dignity is aroused in this way, what happens is mighty. By the 1960s, these assaults on our dignity and those private cries, the scream into the pillow as we lay there, became a roar. Because essentially what happens is we need to find a way to assert our dignity once again, right? And that's where our movement from rights came from, okay? This is where the cry that I am a human being and I have inevitable, inalienable rights, that I was born with these, right? That having a psychiatric diagnosis does not mean that I am without my dignity, without my rights, and that our dignity needed to be protected. And so, of course, I think of the Mental Patients Liberation Front, and I think of the early people like Ted Chabadinsky, you know, himself as a child put on the wards with Loretta Bender at 8, 9, 10-year-old children being drugged with LSD. And he roared back. And Leonard Roy Frank, ECT after ECT, and Leonard came roaring back. Judy Chamberlain, the Mental Patients Liberation Front, Howie the Harp. I mean, there was a pantheon of leaders who emerged, and it was a moment in time where there was a cry, you know, a cry for rights and a cry for alternatives. And I think that cry became contagious, that it wasn't just those of us in the institutions that had the cry, but I think also staff felt profoundly dehumanized in these settings, and that working conditions were unbearable. They came to help, but with such large numbers of people, care is impossible. It just becomes custodial. And so we had more great leaders emerging, you know, and the movement towards psychiatric rehabilitation and the Fountain House model for people networking in the community once released from the institutions, supported housing, the establishment of the National Association for Rights Protection and Advocacy. We had Lauren Mosher, with himself a psychiatrist, with the Soteria House model. I mean, the list goes on and on. There was, I call the roar rocket fuel, that when dignity and the insult to dignity can be harnessed, when that scream can be honed into an effort to change that which has left me wounded, then that is rocket fuel. It is a fire that cannot be extinguished by water, as Martin Luther King taught us. And it is indefatigable. And the rocket fuel is still with us. And that's how come I know that recovery is still alive and still well. It was in its nascent stages, in its rebirth, if you will. But it is alive and kicking. Now, there I was, 17-year-old high school student, experiencing my first episode of psychosis and being admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Just in the midst of this fervor, it was the mid-1970s, just in the midst of this roar that was beginning to percolate and gain momentum. 17 years old, really vulnerable, and especially to the psychiatrists and the mental health professionals who were working with me in the inpatient units. I did not see any of these kind of snake pit, you know, settings. You know, I was in what looked like a comfortable, smaller units. Nevertheless, for me, the most damaging insult to my dignity was being told that, Ms. Deegan, you're a person who has schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a disease from which no one can get well. Schizophrenia is a disease that's a lot like diabetes. Just like a person with diabetes will have to use medication for the rest of their lives, Ms. Deegan, you're going to have to use high-dose antipsychotic medications for your life. And when I was discharged, I was told to avoid stress. Take my meds, take my meds, take my meds, take my meds. And what that meant is, in one sweep of a hand, my life, my future horizon, my goal of becoming an athletic coach evaporated. I was told to avoid stress. I was told no romance, no work, no school. Instead, I sat in a chair in a cloud of cigarette smoke as my friends went off to college and love and romance and work. And I sat my life essentially over me in chemical hibernation. This was an insult to my being, but more precisely to my becoming. That if dignity is defined as the value and worth of our being and our becoming, it was in the area of the becoming that my deepest wounding occurred. I was a schizophrenic, and that was all I could ever be. The horizon of my life had atrophied. And this pronunciation, I call it the prognosis of doom, was given by very powerful people, psychiatrists and Harvard-trained folks, and they seemed formidable to a young teenager. To make a long story short, it took a while, but I found my roar. I did find it, and it moved through me like a freight train, my roar. And eventually I got a doctorate in clinical psychology, And I devoted my life to, as I put it when the thought first came to me, I'm going to become Dr. Deegan, and I'm going to change the mental health system so that no one ever gets hurt in it again. And of course, at 18, I thought I could do it myself. I was wrong. I found this feather from a woodpecker, a downy woodpecker. It's really beautiful. I'll hold it up so you can see it. I found this on my walk while I was composing this talk in my head. And it got me to thinking, yeah, I was like one feather, but a bird can't fly with just the one feather. It's going to take lots of feathers of a woodpecker to be able to fly. And really, it's kind of a nice way to think of it all. All of the contributions we make are part of where we are today, and all are very, very important. But I came roaring out of that experience with a sense, and it's become my roar, is that I'm a person, I'm not an illness. This is me standing on a stage in Israel in December, before the virus hit. And I like this picture because I'm up there doing my thing. I'm still carrying that message 30 years burning down the road. And I still come back to this all the time. We can't learn this often enough. That those of us with diagnoses, we're people, we're not an illness, right? And reclaiming our dignity is part of saying that. And that as mental health professionals working in the field, our challenge is to be bold and brave and daring enough to remain human-hearted while working in our human services, right? Showing up at work with some vulnerability, leading with our humanity, meeting the people who are coming for services on the common ground of our shared humanity. Treatment is not enough. Treatment must exude care. There's no such thing as a system of care. Systems can't care. People care. Finding the common ground of our shared humanity, recognizing the people we're working with are more like us than not. They're not the other. We've been through that. They are fellow human beings with more in common than not. Okay? That is the starting point for all of our services. In '88, I wrote about my experience. It started as a speech called The Conspiracy of Hope. And in 1988, it was published as The Lived Recovery, The Lived Experience of Rehabilitation. And in that paper, I introduced this idea of the lived experience and juxtaposed it to the practitioner who practices rehabilitation. And I said, you know, we don't get tuned up the way a car gets tuned up. We're active subjects who, through action, can develop our story and make steps forward in our own lives. That there are two people in the room, two experts, when we meet with individuals. Recovery, the lived experience of rehabilitation, introducing those of us with the diagnosis as a partner in care, asserting that care must be a co-created. It's not that I, the professional, deliver the service to you, but rather together we co-create the pathway into recovery. Interestingly, one of the next things I did in the 1990s was develop a simulation of what it's like to hear distressing voices. And this is a description of that simulation from my website. It bypasses the heart and it goes straight to bypasses the head and goes straight to the heart. People use, way back in the day, it was an analog tape on a Sony Walkman. Now we, of course, have it on MP3 players. And people have the opportunity to experience distressing voices while having to move through a series of workstations. For instance, a mock emergency room where people are given a mental status exam. And importantly, we staff the mock emergency room very often with voice hearers who themselves have been through emergency room settings, but now they're getting to role play being the psychiatrist. And it's a powerful, powerful training. and what people tell me, and what we learned through, I think it was, we had 9 different research studies on it, saying that in fact it does help to increase empathy. And so what I love about it is that it creates that common ground, an experiential opportunity to relate to what people's experience with hearing voices are. And it's been used by everything from the US Marshals to the justice systems and CTI programs around the country. The FBI uses it, and just huge organizations, medical schools use it, family groups use it. It's quite an interesting phenomena, and it continues to grow and develop. We'll be issuing a new version of it in the upcoming months. We're excited to do that. But I also want to say another thing that's got me really excited is that the hearing voices simulation, I've been working closely with friends in mainland China. We've been working on translating the simulation into Mandarin. In order to do the simulation and develop it, of course, we had to work on getting it culturally resonant. And so I had the nurses meet with voice hearers in China. And they developed the simulation based on the experience of actual voice hearers in China. But here's what was fascinating about that. The overall response of the nurses said, who had never before sat down and talked to people about their voice hearing experience, even though these people had been in the hospital, some of them for many years, the nurses said, it was different. They told us things that weren't in our textbooks. And I said, that's the ticket. That's the ticket, right? So that project is coming along, and we're very excited about that here in my company. In addition, early on in the 90s, I got very involved in state hospital cemetery restoration across the United States. Here we are at Danvers State Hospital. We used an community organizing approach to restore the numbered markers with actual name plaques. And it was an opportunity not just to honor those who had passed on before us from, in this case, Danvers State Hospital, which you see in the background, but also to develop a whole new group of peer leaders who were speaking to the press and delivering a message to the media that we are more than dangerous deviants. So it was a very powerful campaign. And while I was out visiting state hospitals, cemeteries all over the United States, and I'd usually be giving a talk while I was doing it, I also was able to get some money out of SAMHSA in order to do a project looking at our story from the perspective of those of us who were in these institutions. And I partnered with Vanessa Jackson, which you see her manuscript here in her own voice, which captures some of the history of racially segregated asylums and units in the United States. I also partnered with Pomina Yellowbird on wild Indians, Native perspectives on the Hiawatha Asylum for insane Indians, where, by the way, they have built the Hiawatha Golf Course directly over the graves of Native people buried there, you know, who were former inmates of the asylum. And so just for those of you interested, you can get both of these manuscripts off my website for free, and know that a new book is coming out. I've been collaborating with the author with more information about the Canton Asylum for insane Indians. I also, while I was out there, collected images about those quiet acts of resistance, the screams of dignity. Here's a seclusion room, and you can see the rubber mat into which Vivian carved her legacy, reminding the world, I am a person, I am Vivian, not an illness. And if you're interested in this work and want to see more of that, I put a film together with my friend Terry Strecker called The Politics of Memory. And it's the story of what I found about how people resisted dehumanization and undignified acts. Just to speed it up a little bit, by 2000, I went on and got interested in finding common ground and finding and building tools that would allow practitioners and individuals with diagnoses to connect in new and much more recovery-oriented ways. See if I can play this for you. It's really short. So I know I'm out of time now, but I do want to say that I developed Common Ground software in an effort to safeguard people's voice and choice during appointments with their psychiatrist and to help activate and empower people in their own recovery. It's a very scalable model, and right now we've got about 30,000 users of the software across 80 sites in the country, and I've had great partners in the development of the software, including Community Care Behavioral Health and Jim Gavin, who we're going to hear from in a moment. Jim has been a powerful partner and a visionary leader. The same with Lisa Dixon. I've been collaborating with Lisa since 2009 on the on-track model for reaching out in a team-based coordinated specialty care fashion to young people experiencing first episode psychosis. And I can't tell you how rewarding it is to be working with the teams, because when I was a kid, I didn't have that option. And to know that we've progressed in bringing recovery forward to regular everyday people, young folks going through early psychosis is extremely rewarding to me, and it signals that recovery is alive and well. And for me, what Lisa and Jim Gavin and Community Care have in common, and these guys are principled leaders. These people are visionary leaders. These people who will invest time, effort in closing the gap between what is and what should be, right? They see a gap and they want to close that gap. They want to see people getting well. They want to see people recovering. And they put money and they put good thinking and they mobilize resources to give us all a better shot at making our recovery. And so on that note, I guess I'll turn it over to Harvey.
Yes. So Pat, you know, I was thinking about our brief conversation yesterday, and I will confess that Pat was worried that she might be accused of bragging, and I think you found a real balance of being able to use your example and teach us so much, and in no way were you bragging, but just being real about all that you brought and all that's been so essential. I also just want to say that our NIAPRS conference, I'm sort of proud that years ago we had Vanessa and Pamina at our at separate times. So we learned about her through you, I think, and we brought them to New York. So I want to ask Lisa and Jim to put your cameras on. And I just want to say about each of them that they are tremendous partners to Pat and to our system, but I've had the tremendous pleasure to work with them both. Both have been very generous to NIAPRS and the people that we serve. I can try to find, I could read you Lisa's biography and Jim's. I'll just tell you that, again, Lisa's work, whether it's at Columbia, at the Center for Practice Innovation, involved at the On Track program as the editor of Psych Services, all of those have been vehicles for her to really preach the word of recovery to psychiatry, but to the entire field. And Lisa, we're so grateful for that. And Jim Gavin is that extraordinary person within managed care. I mentioned earlier, people were concerned that managed care would miss the whole point of recovery and make no room for it and be about money and medicine. And Jim hasn't been anything like that. And he's been a real partner with Pat and with us at NIAPRS and those conferences I mentioned. Jim has helped hundreds and hundreds of people really come to the conference with his generous scholarships in the past. So he's a real believer. Both of them are people of heart. And I guess I'll turn this over to you, Lisa.
Sure. Thanks, Harvey, and thank you so much, Pat. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay, thanks.
Yes.
Great, thank you. You know, after, I've known Pat for a while now, over 10 years, Pat, as I count the years, and whenever I hear her speak, I actually feel like it's almost a religious experience in a good way. And I almost feel like I don't want to contaminate the airways after hearing her, because there's this kind of inspiration and magic that makes me almost want to cry, frankly. And sort of almost to take a moment of peace and quiet, just to reflect on the things that we just heard. And so I just actually want to do that for just a moment. Okay. I only want to make a few comments. You know, I do kind of have a big mouth, people know, so I'm going to try to keep it short. I just want to say, when I was thinking about recovery, what made it real for me? Because part of my premise here is that, you know, this is a wonderful celebratory experience at the NIAPRS conference, but the fact of the matter is, the recovery message needs to be propagated. It is not necessarily, you know, widely accepted. And I'm just going to talk about the provider community. I mean, we have individuals who are affected who need to understand and live this, and then we have the general community. But I really, you know, I believe we have made huge progress, but I believe we have much more work that needs to be done. And when I think about my own experience and what changed me, it was in 1992 when I was the medical director for the very first assertive community treatment team that was serving homeless adults living with serious mental illness in Baltimore. And this was actually a randomized controlled trial. And I had the good luck and the good fortune to work with two supervisors who had written this grant, Tony Lehman and Jose Arana. And they had the foresight to include two what we called peer advocates, people with lived experience of homelessness and or mental illness, as well as a family outreach worker as a part of these ACT teams. And I did this for like 3 or 4 years, and it completely changed everything of how I was seeing and understanding, you know, I didn't even know what recovery was, and I began to have an idea of what it could be, both, you know, for the individuals who were serving in these roles, for the individuals we were serving, the clients we were serving, and for the professionals who worked on the teams with our consumer advocates and family outreach worker. And you can't go back. It changes everything in terms of how you see what people need and what people can benefit from. And so I wanted to acknowledge that and sort of put that forward as an example of how we need to make change and what we still need to do. And so that's, you know, the idea of continuing to be relentless in our pursuit of the inclusion of peers, of peer support within every single kind of treatment that there is. And of course, even outside of treatment in peer created strategies. I include family members in this as well. But I think that in every way, shape, and form, this needs to be developed, and we need to give voice to the scream and the roar. You know, and of course, and this is why Pat is so brilliant, is that Pat can give voice to that at the same time as extending a hand in partnership, as indicated by her animation, because that is the key. That is a key. It is partnering. It is introducing and including and supporting and showcasing and co-leading with peers, but the partnership with the other team members is critical. So the inclusion of individuals in the system, in the training system, and that's the second point I wanted to make, is we must start with trainees, because, you know, I'm most familiar with psychiatric training, but I believe that this is the case with a lot of other training, is that if you wanted to design a system to create an anti-recovery bias, we have one, unfortunately. Again, starting with, you know, our trainees not really being introduced to a recovery orientation systematically, starting in acute settings, that, while I think on the whole are better than you know, what we had in the dark ages not that long ago, but still a very, very narrow, unfortunately, I think stigma producing, an anti-recovery attitude producing way to begin with our trainees. So we really, really need to get to people from day one. I mean, obviously we need to get to people in the community, but if we're going to focus on, you know, where we're going to have a lot of bang for our buck, I think we must address how to inculcate recovery notions and principles and partnership in the training system. And I give props to Stephanie Lamel, who's the director of the public psychiatry program at Columbia New York State Psychiatric Institute, who has, they have now have consumer advocates peers partnering with each of the public psychiatry fellows, teaching, mentoring, and that's exactly the kind of strategies we need to introduce across the board. And then I wanted to just another really powerful method that we need to develop and use. Pat is the master at creating tools. So we need tools that are available, that are relatively easy to implement, that make sense to people. And again, a lot of what, you know, the tools that are available on Common Ground, tools to, for example, support shared decision-making, where the tools do the teaching, where it's not you need to be taught, but in some sense where the tools are the forward engine of doing the right thing, of being recovery-oriented. And I think we have a lot out there. You know, we're working on developing more. But I think that we need to think from an implementation standpoint in terms of tools. And then ultimately, of course, the real way to do this is to change the care system. I mean, that we wouldn't need to be, you know, going after psychiatric residents with a recovery focus if the actual care were more recovery oriented, because then they would see it and live it. And but you know, I always say, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's you know, incremental. You know, we are all in this march together. And then I'm just going to end by again just emphasizing that. Well, let me tell a story. And as Pat mentioned, she's been working with the On Track program since the beginning. And the way that we you know, provide our kind of consultation to the teams is we have these monthly calls with each of the clinicians. So we'll have a monthly call with the psychiatrists, nurse practitioners. We'll have a monthly call with the individual placement and support workers. And Pat was on the phone every month with the psychiatrists and nurse practitioners discussing issues of medication. And when we shifted, when we had a shift from the research study to on track, we did a reevaluation and we asked our end users, that is to say the people who were our trainees, what do you want for your training? What worked? What should we continue to do? Okay. And you know what? To a person, every single individual, all our doctors and nurse practitioners said, we want Pat. Okay? We want Pat to continue to be on these calls. And they had access to the expert psychopharmacologist, whatever, but they, Pat, and that I think, you know, is a testament to numerous things: Pat's wisdom, the beauty of her language and her perspective, but also I think it really speaks to the fact that she partnered with them, and that's how they felt. So thank you very much. I so appreciate this opportunity to be a part of this panel.
I'm sorry, can people hear me?
Just saying a word. Oh, I'm sorry, Jim. I'm saying a word or two. I left
Okay,
some
sure.
silence. I just wanted to thank Lisa for your wonderful words. I just want to comment. If you go to the NIAPRA's website and check out the words collective, the collective was created out of a recognition that in many ways academia was still turning out people who need to be trained or retrained. So, and the other powerful way that people learn and change, I think, is, as you say, Lisa, the care system, and having peers inculcated in all services is how many people learn experientially about peer support. So Jim, please take it away.
Thank you, Harvey. Pat, Lisa, thank you. Whenever I hear you, Pat, it affirms for me the importance of our decision 15 years ago when James Schuster and I first heard you at a conference in Pittsburgh. And Lisa, we were crying. And I looked at James and he looked at me, and I think we both felt the exact same thing, that this has got, and this was only 5 years into our existence at that time, that we both said that, you know, Pat needs to be the face of community care's recovery initiatives. And we've had a 15-year, I'm making up the numbers a little bit, but I do think around 15-year relationship. And we've been a part of the evolving set of tools. We've often been the inaugural site for a lot of that work. The face of our work has been Pat Deegan. And having known and worked with you, Pat, for 15 years, I know exactly why that is. I do think the tools are necessary. I'm going to go back. I had written down a number of things here, but I'm going to move off that. I'm going to talk about some of the things that Lisa said about the importance of the provider community. I think we have an opportunity in what community care was able to do, and I was fortunate enough to be sitting in the CEO's chair at the time. It had as little to do with me as it did with any other individual in the executive suite or the overall work that we did. We all came out of public psychiatry. We didn't work with people who didn't believe in the concepts that we're discussing here today. People who came to our organization that didn't stay long. It was truly a culture of a commitment to this work. And we knew early on, I came out of the provider community. I'm a social worker by training. I came out of the clinical world. I started in '73. I did work for Mnuchin years ago. And so I had a general sense of some of the structural work. And then as the recovery concepts and peer concepts evolved, I personally, and all of those who I work around, were on board with that. I think Pat would attest to this. But when we talk about the tools, and I agree, the tools are critical. There's two things I'd like to mention that I think are important if in fact we're going to get to the, or I don't know that you ever get to the finish line. Pat uses the word progress instead of change. She said to me once, I'm not looking for change, I'm looking for progress. And I do think that's all we can hope for. I retired this past December, still with the company in an advisory status. But I had to reckon with the fact that there really isn't closure on these things. It's just the system is in recovery. I'm in recovery. We're all trying to figure out how to get to the next place and make what are acceptable and satisfactory contributions to the work. But the tools themselves are what they are because they're credible. And they're credible because of who did them. And I believe this, that if you don't have credibility, find a way to buy it somewhere. Do not spend years and years trying to develop a credibility that people like Pat Deegan and many others in this field, Peggy Swarbrick was mentioned earlier, can bring to the work. And you don't have to climb that credibility ladder, which is critical. I also believe, and agree with Lisa on this, the workforce is hungry for attention. The main problem in the work that I've observed over the 47 or so years that I've been doing it is the instability of the workforce and the abandonment of the workforce as it relates to the concepts we're talking about here. And that's driven by two things, but the main reason, I'm going to rely on this, it may or may not be factual. I think the payer system that we have used over the years has undermined the quality and therefore undermined the opportunity for a recovery-oriented system, a recovery-oriented people. I agree 100% with Pat's concept of value, humanity, and citizenship. And what's that really all about? I always think of it in terms of what's been taken from the folks that are in recovery, and it's often citizenship. When we talk about the concepts of discrimination, I don't think there's anyone who has been in that seat any more than people who have chronic illness. And our connection to Pat Deegan was based on the fact that she brought instant credibility and she brought a passion. You take passion out of the equation, there's not enough energy to do this work. And what we have is an obligation as a payer and as a policymakers and everyone else to give the people delivering the care, the providers that Lisa mentioned, and I couldn't agree more, give them the energy they need to make to transform into a culture that can actually endorse and support recovery. It's been my experience that when you offer it, staff not only accept it, but embrace it. I do think that we cannot, when we think of the concept of training, we often think of the concept of content. I do not. Other people bring content. I think what we have to commit to is making this transformation or anything else we think is important from an information perspective a part of a culture. And that cannot be done, in my view, it cannot be done in a training session. It cannot be done via education. It has to be done via interaction. And our obligation, and Pat knows this, we've had learning collaboratives that have gone on for years. The content has changed, but the collaborative platform has remained intact. I'll tell you a story about the first collaborative Pat did for us. And I remember that day, Pat, standing on the stage in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We had about 50 or more agencies in front of us. And the agencies to participate, and we were only managing maybe at that time 500,000 members, maybe less, I can't remember. But it was a considerable audience as it relates to being able to impact the people who were being served. And people were required, coming to that, to bring an executive, preferably the CEO, a clinical leader, preferably the chief clinical officer or chief medical officer, whatever they had, a peer, and then a person who would be taking the clinical leadership within the organization for the project. And you'll remember that, Pat. They all came and they all participated, and it was typical providers. What's this all about? What's this all about? And if you rely on one session, the chances of answering that question are pretty close to zero. So these learning collaboratives persisted. And a few years later in Penn State, we asked these same 50 agencies to come to what we were referring to as a wrap-up session. But as Pat knows, I don't believe in wrapping up collaborative training. It has to be embedded as a part of the culture. And every agency except for one brought the same 4 people who were at the original session to this wrap up in State College. And I got to tell you, I've been at this work a long time, and I don't ever remember feeling any better about something that seemed to get some traction. Now, the responsibility of the payer in many ways is to keep the CEOs out of the discussion. So what you want is you want the CEOs talking to the payer and making the problems so that they have to live and work on related to board and finances and all that stuff, a payer interchange instead of a downstream interchange within the organization. The other thing that needs to happen with this is that, and if you do this collaborative work, people begin to support each other. People begin to talk to each other across agencies, and a whole new dynamic develops that clinical people need in order to keep the energy necessary to persist in this work. There's enough stress. I'll close with this. At that closing session, in the Q&A side of it, many, and I've heard this at every closing collaborative session that we've had, every time people talk about the cultural ripple of these trainings within their organization. That's the key to the future. Information absent sustained interface will not, in my opinion, get us where we need to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. I'm going to close. We have questions in the chat box. I'm going to have to respond to a few of them. First of all, I just want to say something. When you said systems don't care, people care, that was the moment for me today, and thank you so much for that. I wept a little bit myself there. People have met, a lot of talk about hearing voices, a lot of talk about its use with police, just in general. If you go to patdeegan.com, you can see a lot more about that. Some concerns about the political environment, the change in Washington, the always threat of outpatient sort of commitment, the concern that bail reform will now allow people that were unduly transferred to the correctional system to be offered a way out into the community, but will the supports be there? NIAPRS in its political side is focused on all that. We know we've been a leader and an opponent of Kendra's law since its inception. And so I'm certainly happy if you want to talk to me more about the political side, you can reach me at harveyr@niaprs.org. Economic factors were mentioned by a number of people, Pat, in terms of if you have the beds. I've certainly seen it, the money's often in the system in the wrong place. I used to say I've spent my career trying to get other people's money and moved into where it belongs. So I definitely want to pay attention to that. And finally, some real discussion around a number of people talking about recovery and how they recover. A provider saying this was so transformative for them to hear this. And finally, concerns about power sharing and the power of the common ground approach in communicating with your doctor, and the power of open dialogue in getting everyone on a footing and listening to the person. And I want to put a shout out for Project Inset at the MHA Westchester, something we've created together that is the alternative to outpatient commitment and relies on open dialogue. So thank you, everybody. I think I'm turning this over to, is it Edie, to introduce Drew? Would Len or would Eileen know? Edie, you're there. Okay, Edie, you're on. There they are. Okay.
Hi, Harvey.
Yeah, you're on.
Hi, do you still have some time for questions?
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. I thought you guys were preparing.
No,
Okay.
You have till 10:30, so you've got some time to do questions.
Right. Well, I thought I had to rush, so I was answering some.
You're so good, and I'm so proud of you. But yes, you can get some questions.
Thank you, Edie. You're so appreciated. So I don't know. I mean, I could read them to you, but they're pretty. Here's a question for Pat. Pat, they're interested in what you think of the MAD studies movement. How's that for a question?
Sure. I think that can you hear me now? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think the MAD studies movement is really, really important. You know, I think that, you know, I'm familiar with some of the literature coming out of the MAD studies movement. It's always provocative. It gets me thinking. It keeps me on my toes. It's great to have this kind of robust discourse in our language, in our words, and I find it very challenging. I'll always remember something that David Oakes, of course, the founder of Mind Freedom International and an extraordinary hero, and boy, does that guy roar in terms of, oh, he can sure roar. And he taught me that, you know, in order to cook an omelet, you got to have some heat. And I've always appreciated the heat because I recognize that my gift is not creating that kind of heat, the heat of, you know, brilliant, incisive ideas that kindle and uproot. I mean, I think that, you know, the MAD Underground in general creates alternatives, paradigms for us that get us thinking, and that so I welcome it. I remain rooted in it, but I know that all of us have a gift that we're bringing, as Harvey calls it, under the big tent. And there's room for us all that if you've got heat and, you know, you can be helping us cook this omelet that we call, you know, dignity and services that are, you know, that protect the voice and choice of individuals, including the voice and choice of service providers as well. Because that's the big secret, right? You know, we act like there is this divide between the people who are receiving services and the people providing services. And there can be some differences. I'm not saying we're exactly the same, but I know that the people who come to this field, the ones that can stay in, anyone can do it for 6 months, but try 6 years or 15 years. Those are the ones who come because they're bearing a gift within their own heart. They have seen their own adversity, that they too have made a passage. And I don't know what that passage might be. It might be a passage through their own diagnosis, or it might have been a passage to the death of a loved one or child abuse growing up. Whatever passage they have made, they came out of something that they thought might kill them on fire. And they have the gift of hope. They have the gift and understanding of the importance of dignity. And I think that they too, that's why I'm always talking, I've always seen my work as translational. I don't just wear one hat. And at one point, I'm just going to share this story really anecdotally, but real quick. When I was first in the early 1990s coming out and I was talking around at local state hospitals up on the units to the patients, and I was talking about being someone who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and someone who also had a doctorate in clinical psychology, I got a cease and desist letter from the Massachusetts Psychological Association telling me that I could not be both in public. One or the other, Pat. Luckily, I wasn't a member, and I didn't worry, and I kept on going. But I think insisting, you know, and finding our niche and what it is we do well, and for me, it's that translational piece, wearing the two hats at the same time, almost translating between two worlds and helping us recognize that we have more in common than not. So yeah, there's a lot of good people working in our field, and it ain't because it pays real well. It's because they're passionate about what it is that they do.
Thank you, Pat. I want to just, I don't even know where to begin, but I'm really supposed to end. So I would just try to do a couple more here. Back, somebody asked a couple of questions about NIAPers and Medicaid money and policy. Let me skip left quick and say, people don't do this job for the money, and you certainly see it now when people are putting their lives on the line because of the virus, people in our field. And by the way, yesterday, the Office of Mental Health got at least 750,000 washable masks donated by the Hanes company, the underwear company. And those masks are moving to the localities, and the county mental health departments will have access to them. So be prepared to hear from your county about that. But in terms of Medicaid, we are fighting the Medicaid cuts. We're working with Medicaid Matters and the cross disability groups. We're working hard, and I was just doing a little bit of emailing while we were doing this. Folks in Washington to try to really push in Washington to move money in CARES 2 the next round of COVID money, moving to the states as well. They don't want to do that right now. The GOP doesn't want to do that, so we really need that money in New York. The governor says that very, very correctly all the time. There's a line we're trying to get in the federal budget for $38.5 billion for the behavioral health workforce. So we're definitely aware of that. And of course, lack of money really drives a lack of care and a lack of staff who will be able to sustain themselves in these jobs. So let me see if there's any other question. People mentioned the dignity of risk, and it's important that older people be afforded that too in our system. And let me just see, there's one other one that I really want to end with maybe. When one has lived experience, self and family members, but not a peer certification, any suggestions on how to share and present oneself in the professional arena?
Yeah, so I think that this is a really important question. I think that one needs to take great care in, quote, coming out, that it is not always met with a warm embrace. There are risks that we take in coming out and insisting, if we will, to wear the two hats of all of who we are. And so I'll point you to a group in the Veterans Administration. These are very high-level clinicians working across the United States in the VA who have formed a group about and have come out en masse on some level around their status as people who are working in a professional role. They are not trying to be peer specialists, but they are open to sharing some of their experiences with people they might be doing therapy with or psychopharm with or whatever it is they're doing. And so this is a really interesting idea. And I think the people at the VA are very brave and they're honest. It can affect your career when you run in, but that's the stigma in our own house, the discrimination in our own house. And we've got to grapple with that.
Can I was hoping that, this is Lisa, I could put in a plug, Pat, for your column, your psychiatric services column. Pat edits a column called Personal Accounts, First Person Accounts. And one way I would put forward, if you're comfortable, is to write something and share your experience. And Pat edits a column for psych services that does that.
Well, I'm gonna thank everybody, and Pat, you've done for so many people. I can see from the chat box what you've done for me and so many of us. And I just want to thank all of you that are out there, because Pat mentioned the big tent, something we've talked about from the beginning. This tent that all of you are in, I see the names of so many of you who've been with us in this tent all these years, and we're all being refreshed by Pat's words and being reinforced by the courage of Jim and Lisa in psychiatry and managed care. But I want to give a shout out to all of you. You've been in this big tent a long time. You're people of heart. You've been part of the change, and certainly Pat's our leader, but so are you. You're all pioneers in so many ways. So I want to thank you all for coming on, and I want to turn this over to, I'm not sure who should, whether is Edie coming on now? Len, do you know?
Yes.
She's working on it now.
Edie should be joining us shortly.
All right, so we're going to leave. I'm going to leave, and Jim and Pat and Lisa, why don't we all leave and we'll turn it over to them. Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Now we can, Edie.
Okay, I'm sorry we're having technical difficulties and I apologize for that. Somehow I got kicked off and I'm not going to take it personally. So Drew, can you come on screen? Oh, I'm sorry, are we ready? We are. Excellent.
Yes, can you
Okay.
see the screen?
Yes, and here I am as well. I had to come in another way, so I apologize to all our guests today. And I'm going to run right into it then. So we're very lucky today and very pleased to have Drew DiGiovanni with us for this wonderful talk on Take Charge of Your Culture. Drew has worked in many settings for many years in leadership positions, and he's been involved in performance improvement and strategic planning and quality assurance. He's worked for FQHCs, major medical groups, hospitals, community organizations, and most recently, Drew is a senior associate with our friends at Open Minds. And you heard this morning in the talk with Pat and Jim, and we didn't even pay them to bring this up, but they walked right into the reason that we asked Drew to come with us today and talk about agency culture, because without the culture of recovery and the culture of dignity and understanding, you can't have any kind of change to a recovery-oriented system of care. So we are very pleased to be able to talk with Drew this morning, and then again for a deeper dive at 11:30 into your organizational culture, assessing it, and helping it to change. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Drew DiGiovanni.
Thank you, Edie. Well, and thank you everyone for listening today. Thank you for the invitation to present. Take charge of your culture. This was the theme we discussed months ago as we were considering all of the pressures on our organizations, whether it be accreditation, licensure, changing reimbursement, value-based reimbursement. Jim was talking about a number of these factors today that are putting pressure on our organizations. And now, over the last 2 months, we've had incredible change happening in the environment, incredible pressure. Organizations are being asked to turn on a dime, and that's not always so easy. And so I think this is really changed in its nature here. I'm gonna just move my slide forward and see what's going on. Pardon me. Okay, sorry about that. Let's come back. All right, so our agenda for today, we're gonna start by doing a pulse check on what's happening out there. Let's also look at then a conceptual framework on how to think about culture, visualize it, and actually measure it. This is a framework I've been working with for about the last 15 years and applying it to a number of different healthcare organizations around the country. We feel culture in our gut, and this actually helps us to see it. And we're going to be talking about the functions of culture and how they serve you and the normal dysfunctions that come with culture as well. Identify
Drew,
the tensions
can
that
I
are-
just jump in and ask you to come back on screen? We've got we over here, the presenters boxes have way too much to do at the same time. Just flip your camera back on. Oh, we're having, this is, you know, we've done pretty well with not having technical difficulties, but this is not the day, obviously. So if you all will just bear with us just another minute, you're going to be, have a great presentation. There we go. Okay, and now just get your slides back up and we should be all set to go.
All right, can you see my slides and my pop-ups are going along?
Yeah, 1 minute and we will have it all back together, guys. Thank you so much, and thank you, Drew.
Thank you. Hey, then we're going to look at the tensions that are placed on organization culture given the changes that are happening out in the environment. It's important to be thinking about that so you can take control first by recognizing what's the profile of your culture and then what's happening to it and what can you do. And in our breakout session, then we'll talk about change strategies as well. So our learning objective today is to reflect on your own organization's cultural profile, its functions, its limitations, and identify the dominant culture profile that you may have. As Edie mentioned, I started out my career in behavioral health. I have a Master of Public Health degree from UCLA. And I spent my early career working in clinical education, and was asked one day to begin to think about doing leadership development and organization development for a large hospital system. I said, why not? And I think since that very day, I've discovered that my personal mission is organization healing, not just working with the healing of those individuals that we serve. About 15 years ago, I was working for the Medical Group Management Association, putting together executive training for executive leaders of large health systems around the country, and was asked to come up with some strategy around the topic of organization culture. And as I did some research, I found this particular model called the Competing Values Framework. And so this is what we're going to be covering today, is really a simple model where we divide culture into 4 components. The aspects of collaboration, how we create, how we compete out in the market, and what are our standards around control, efficiency, and having a stable organization. So with that, I'm going to start our polls in just a minute, but first we'll talk about our ground rules. There's no right or wrong organization culture. We don't judge it. So as you measure your culture, as you begin to think about your own profile, it serves you and it's there for a reason. But we ask, is it serving you in the future? Do you want to make some incremental adjustments to your culture, and how can you consciously do that? As Drucker says, in normal times, we are in one of the greatest historical periods that occur every 200 to 300 years when people don't understand the world anymore. And it's not sufficient to be able to explain the future. And this is certainly true of this unprecedented times in which we live. So as we look at this first question, there's going to be a little poll that's going to pop up on your screen. Do you consider your organization to have been nimble in this short transition to deal with COVID-19? Answer yes, somewhat, or no. Do you feel like you've been nimble? Go ahead and click on one of those answers with your mouse, and then click submit. Okay, well, go ahead and look at the answers now. The majority of you said yes, about 57%, 37% said somewhat, and about 5% said that was, they're challenged to be nimble. We'll maybe explain why. And nimbleness is one of these aspects of culture, which we call adhocracy, or that creation, that flexibility, and so forth. So let's move on to the next question. Our organization is focused on compliance with state medical, Medicare, Medi-Cal, Medicaid rules over the people we serve. So what is more important? People that you serve and flexing a little bit, or staying in compliance? Answer yes, somewhat, or no. Okay, let's go ahead and look at our answers. A lot of somewhats. So some people are bending the rules a little bit. In fact, we're seeing a lot of states. I just did a survey several weeks ago of state organizations and Medicaid offices across all 50 regions to find that maybe 5, maybe 6 still had some pretty strict rules in place, but almost everybody has relaxed their rules. And it occurred to me some people might be kind of bending them a little bit to make sure that they're able to serve people in this time when we need to have more flexibility. Let's look at the next question. Clinicians and staff were resistant to change in this transitional period. Yes, somewhat, or no? Clinicians and staff were resistant to change during this transitional period. Answer the question and click submit. And we'll go ahead and take a look at our poll here. No. 56% said no, but about 12% and let's see this up close. About 32% said somewhat, 12% said yes. So there was some resistance out there, and that's absolutely normal whenever we have change in an organization. No matter what the change is, we might expect that. And I think I applaud those who did not experience resistance, because people are trying to go with the flow and making incredible effort out there in the field. Did any of you change your service lines? Either you discontinued a service or you opened up a new service, but did you make any changes to the services that you provide out in the field? Yes, somewhat, or no? Place your answer and please click submit. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the answers there. Most of you said no, but most of you said yes. 67% said that they had either some closure, some change. 18% said somewhat, and there were some people who said no, there was no change in this difficult period. Well, let's move on. This kind of gives us a pulse check. Were you able to change the delivery or needing to change the delivery of services to your population served? Let's go ahead and close this. You know, Peter Drucker always has said this famous line that said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And one thing we're going to find today is that's half true. I find also, as we look at the life cycle of businesses, every business has a startup mode in the first few years. They may go into rapid growth and then maturity. It's normal to go into decline. Every organization does it, whether it's a retail business, a service organization, a healthcare organization, a bookstore, a church, temple, or place of faith. Everyone experiences this cycle, and what we want to be able to do as we're going into decline is go into that rebirth and that phase where we can innovate, respond to changes in the market, and get out of that, what I might call death spiral. So as we look at the competing values framework, which is a method of measuring culture, we'll note that it was developed by Dr. Kim Cameron and Dr. Robert Quinn from the University of Michigan. I got to study with Dr. Kim Cameron back in 2005. We invited him to do a series of workshops at the Medical Group Management Association. His fees at the time were about $10,000 a day. And most of his work is done with Fortune 500 companies. So really impressive work. This research started by looking at some better performing organizations like Southwest Airlines, Walmart, Tyson Foods. This was back in the 80s when Circuit City was still a brick and mortar facility. So they built the framework, they built an assessment tool so that organizations could actually measure and see that. And it's based on 4 aspects of culture: stability, flexibility, internal and external focus. And let's take a look at that. I'm going to get technical for a couple of minutes, but it's fascinating to see this model come to life. So one of the things they looked at statistically were organizations either were along the lines of having a lot of stability, or they were along the lines of having a lot of flexibility. They were either internally focused, focused on the people that they are serving, or focused on the team members, focused on each other, as opposed to focused on the external market. And so we see in this first quadrant, as we break this up into 4 quadrants here, this whole aspect of control and doing things right. And we're going to call that hierarchy. So they gave these kind of fun names. And then in the next kind of opposing quadrant, we look at creating and doing things new. And we call that adhocracy, like ad hoc, being kind of on the dime, flying by the seat of your pants, which we'll look at in a minute. And as is a really common aspect of culture in healthcare in general, in behavioral health, especially in peer support services, is that whole ability to collaborate. And we call that clan, and it's doing things together. That's opposed with organizations that are focused on competing in the market, maybe manufacturing organizations, maybe LG versus Sony versus Samsung. They're all trying to get market share, and they're all trying to do things fast. Look at Android and Apple trying to get to market with their biggest improvements as quickly as possible. So let's look at this in a little more depth. Hierarchy is one of the original foundations of culture in the United States. And as the train system began to emerge in the 1800s, they looked for a system of management. They're managing across regions. They invented time zones and so forth, and they borrowed from the military. So a big emphasis on chain of command, smooth processes, a lot of policies and procedures, adherence to standards, a need for efficiency, probably a lot of asking for permission, and having to go through maybe some level of bureaucracy. So we all have this aspect in our organizations, as we all have all four quadrants, but some might be dominant. And I'll contrast this with adhocracy, which is focused on innovation, new products and services, autonomy, flying by the seat of your pants. Startup organizations cannot survive if they've got a lot of rules and regulations. They've got to be able to adjust and move very quickly. And therefore, they don't have a lot of policies and procedures and a lot of bureaucracy. That can be kind of crazy making too, because you are flying by the seat of your pants. I think of my niece who worked for Zynga. They make Farmville and other games. And as a startup organization, there were not a lot of rules other than you had to work a lot of hours. There were dogs running around. There's beer in the refrigerator. We would never think of having alcohol on site in healthcare in general, but particularly in our line of work. So what we see here is really a whole different sort of bending the rules and creating our own rules on the fly. When I think of hierarchy, by the way, I might think of like a post office, government services. We want our city services to run smoothly. We want the stoplights to be working. We want rules to be followed and laws to be applied across the board in a uniform way. So we see kind of these are sort of opposing stable versus nimble. The next aspect I'll go into a little more depth is clan, and that's a real focus on teamwork, feeling like a family, sensitivity to our customers, the people that we serve, communication, mentoring, and training. And the people that we serve are very much in this quadrant as well. And I'm gonna oppose that by a more competitive approach, which is focused on the marketplace, maybe the populations that we want to be serving, but we're not necessarily have come through our doors yet. But we're certainly focused on running like a business, and we're focused on growing, measuring outcomes, reporting performance measures that might sound familiar if you're engaging in value-based care. Managed care over the years has really been driving healthcare from clan more towards market for a lot of reasons, but let's be thinking about that. So as you consider your organization having all of these aspects of culture, know that one or two is dominant. We call this a competing values framework because as we assess in these 6 areas, dominant characteristics, organization leadership, management of staff and volunteers, the glue of the organization, how we're strategic. Are we strategically looking at the market? Are we strategically looking at how we're building our teams, and what's our criteria for success. These are the 6 questions that are asked as we do this assessment. And as a person scores it, it is then put into a grid, and you're asked to divide these up, these 4 quadrants, by 100 points. And so we're going to see that we have to force ourselves to compete with these various values. You know, we can't have 100% clan and 100% market, because they sort of tug or they pull upon each other. I'll mention this book if you're interested in diagnosing and completing the assessment in your organization. I have the 2nd edition here, Diagnosing and Changing Your Organization Culture by Kim Cameron and Robert Quinn. I really encourage you to purchase this book. It's got the assessment tool built in. Fair use, you can copy it with your teams and begin to look at the profile. You will see individuals coming up with scores that are a little bit different based on their perception of the organization, their profession, their orientation to various service lines and so forth. But this is the grid where we actually map your organization culture. So let's look at a profile of a small organization. Might be typical of many organizations here represented today, which would be pretty high in clan. We're very team-oriented. We're very sensitive to the people that we serve. We're fairly flexible. We may not have as much hierarchy. That might depend on whether you're accredited. Accredited organizations are going to be required to have a lot of policies and procedures which shift them down into hierarchy. Joint Commission did that for a reason. So that we really had organizations that were stable and maybe with more uniform outcomes. And certainly we're seeing a shift from all of these quadrants more towards market with value-based care, managed care, value-based reimbursement as a driver. So it's very interesting to map out your culture. Let's look at a larger organization. This is a large health system that's been around for a while. Because it's larger and as organizations merge and grow, they automatically kind of drive towards market. This is obviously accredited, and I'm a little concerned here. There's not maybe 20% clan. I would expect to see that in a manufacturing setting. I might want to see a little bit more. And if you were to be leading behavioral health, addiction services, mental health in this type of organization, you might actually having to be working up against an organization that is less customer, client, people served sensitive, and you might want to be working more towards a clan orientation in your particular service line. So this tells us that as organizations grow, they automatically become more market focused. I worked for an organization where we had 50 health centers across many different states of the country, and we grew in 5 years to 150 health centers across the country. And initially there were 5 leaders at the table. Everybody was the jack of all trades. They kind of did everything. And as we grew, in 5 years later, we had 70 people around the table in very specialized roles. So it went from feeling like a family to feeling like a really big organization. And that's just normal with growth. So we look at the functions of culture in this model that serve your organizations. And you will have a dominant quadrant here, maybe 2 dominant quadrants. In healthcare, we often have either clan and hierarchy or clan and adhocracy. In some of the physician practices that I've worked with, particularly in specialty services, doctors are not always working as a group. They're kind of doing their own thing. So I see more adhocracy maybe in some of the specialty practices than I see in behavioral health in general, where we tend to see clan as the dominant culture. But with a dominant culture and the functions of culture, we normally see these dysfunctions. It's normal. So with clan, you might recognize these, maybe overprotecting people. We don't have as strong of performance expectations as we do with market. We see cliques. We see some conflict aversion, and I'll tell you, sometimes we see coup d'etat. I'll mention that in a moment when I see market leaders who are trying to drive the organization away from clan to be running more like a business can sometimes move a little too quickly, and we do see some coup occurring in this dominant culture. In hierarchy, we see fear culture, we see bureaucracy, perfectionism, taking a long time to get something to launch because we've got so many layers. I had a friend from college who went from a startup organization, Oracle, when they were brand new. By the way, he retired when he was 40, but he went to work later for Xerox and took 6 months to get a laptop computer in order to do his job. That 6-month period was due to all the red tape that needed to go through to just be able to have a basic tool. So, you know, a lot of hierarchy can really slow an organization down. Certainly with adhocracy, we have instability, we have independent decisions. Sometimes we're given a goal and told abandon that, we've got to move on to a new project before we've finished it. There's not always a lot of clarity about who we're reporting to. So there's this leadership ambiguity, and we're not always following regulations. We saw that with Uber as they were a startup company and did not move maybe as quickly as they needed to into having some compliance issues solved and some good compliance training. Finally, with market, we see more competition, maybe some backstabbing. Leaders are ignoring conflict and we don't have as much communication, maybe some more siloing. We're going to see the dysfunctions be kind of opposite of what we see in clan. So you might want to be thinking about what dysfunctions occur in your organization. It's going to give you some sense of your dominance and kind of reinforce what you're thinking as well. Certainly, if we get caught too far to the left of this curve, when we're really maturing as an organization, we tend to move over time into clan and into hierarchy. It's just a natural kind of settling of a mature organization. And that makes it harder to be innovating and really going into our rebirth. Let's talk about what happens when there's a change or a dynamic happening in our external environment and how that places tension on culture. Or maybe there's a change internally as well. We're getting accredited and suddenly we have 30 or 40 new policies and procedures that we need to follow. And we all know that accreditation organizations used to just say, you know, you could write these policies and procedures and put them on the shelf. Now they're actually talking to staff and volunteers and maybe even the people that we serve to say, how are you following this process, and tell me about it. So as there is a change, we're putting tension on the fabric of the organization. As a new leader may come in and helping us to grow the organization or operate more like a business, they're really pulling on that fabric. And they're pulling from clan typically towards market. They're moving the organization culture diagonally. And there's resistance and response to that. It's normal. It's why we need to be very strategic about the changes that we make and be very conscious of our existing culture and the tension that we are placing as leaders on the organization. When I go into an organization and I put my ear to the ground and I hear name calling, it's typically because a leader, they're not a bad leader at all, but they're just operating outside the dominant culture. So, you know, I have a colleague who was not able to get her needs met, serving the healthcare needs of a very large government organization, which was they contracted to serve. So she kind of had to build her own silo, and she was considered rogue. Someone else I worked with who came into a clan culture, and this person had come from the post office, and from a government organization and was considered rigid or bureaucratic. Very interested in running a very stable organization, but because they were different than the rest, they were called rigid or military bureaucrat. You know, when I hear somebody, oh, they're rude or they're aggressive, but they only care about money, it's because they're driving more of a market culture. And certainly then when I hear mother hen or somebody's driving a country club, I don't hear this as much in healthcare because we don't recognize people who are like us. So if we were all in a hierarchical culture and someone else was also very hierarchical, we would not call them rigid. We would just think, well, they're like the rest of us. So I hear this name calling. I also hear words like bitch and bastard and asshole. Those are not necessarily gender specific. Those are names that are called with leaders who are operating outside of the culture. And when we're hearing these words, it means that there's tension being placed internally. When I hear complaining, you know, I can't get all of the work done that I need to do with all these new initiatives. So people are trying to get their day-to-day done when there is important strategy and strategic change that's occurring. Maybe we've not allowed for resources to be placed for those new initiatives. We're going to hear complaining about everything that's new. When we're seeing growth, as I mentioned, or seeing a move towards market, there's this common thing, you've all heard it in your organizations, we're not a family anymore. All they care about is data or money. I was working with a rehab organization several years ago. This was physical rehab. It was physical therapy, OT, speech therapy up in Colorado. And so the leaders of the organization wanted a more interdisciplinary approach and a team approach. Everybody had been operating in their disciplines in kind of silos, and they knew they'd have it better outcomes if they operated as a team. Started out with a team building exercise over a day-long period as a kind of a kickoff, and this was the response. This team building is taking away from our work. It's a waste of time. People were really used to working in a very productive environment, and it was really showing maybe some resistance to starting to work as a team. And finally, when we're moving towards a more bureaucratic, hierarchical direction in our culture, people are going to feel handcuffed. They might have had a lot of autonomy in the past, but with organization changes, with rules and regulations, or more specialized roles, people are going to be feeling handcuffed. When we look at the drivers of organization culture, we look at those that are internal. I've been mentioning the leadership influences. Someone's driving maybe a different culture and they've come in from the outside, or maybe they're making a change. It's the values of leaders as well, the maturity of the organization. Certainly organizations that have volunteerism, a lot of volunteers are going to be a lot more clan-oriented than organizations that don't have that. And I'll come back to the skills of leadership and of leaders in a moment. Externally, I've talked about accreditation, populations with special needs. So we can take two identical organizations, same staff, same leaders, but place them in different marketplaces, in different populations, in a rural orientation versus urban. A lot of different settings, and we're going to see those external pressures really starting to shape culture as well. This is a dynamic model, meaning that the skill sets of leaders very much are shaping this organization. And at the University of Michigan, their MBA program and their business programs are very much interested in developing skill sets for leaders to be able to strategically drive any aspect or quadrant of culture. So if you're needing to move into a market type culture because of value-based reimbursement, they have the skill set to make that move. Not everybody has that. We'll be talking about some of the change strategies in our breakout session coming up. But one thing I've observed over the last 15 years working with this particular model is that I see a pattern, and I don't mean to stereotype here, but I do tend to see that people's professional training very much impact the culture that they are driving. This isn't always the formal leadership. Sometimes it's informal. So we may have a CEO who's very externally focused. They're not necessarily around a lot, and they're delegating a lot of power to either the COO or the CFO. So it's who has the center of power, I think, is going to drive culture, not just necessarily the name of a particular leader. Accountants, people in finance are trained for stability and control. And they're trained to make sure that our finances are orderly, they're accurate, that we're efficient, we're making money. There's a lot of hierarchy and rules, regulations around finances. And so that's people's orientation, how they grow up in their profession. And I'll contrast that with social workers, nurses, often are driving plan because they're people oriented. That's what they do and what they know. I worked with an organization that was a telehealth organization. It was in startup mode, but it was driven by leaders who had come from sales. And actually the sales team was larger than the physician team who were actually delivering telehealth services. They were doing behavioral health as well, but very market culture focused because sales was in power. I think physicians can be all over the place as we look at physician leaders, depending on their orientation, where they were trained, what's their specialty. As I mentioned, specialty, maybe the specialty physician organizations are going to be a little more doing your own thing. Some of the primary care docs are going to be a little more focused on standardization and a little more team focused as well. As I wrap up, we've talked about some of the drivers of culture. We've looked at a culture profile, and I want you to be able to reflect on your culture and what is the driver of your particular organization. What are the external drivers going on? This is a great time to reflect on that. Who's in leadership? What are their skill sets? What are they driving? What organization initiatives and strategic initiatives have you had? And certainly as you answered those poll questions, did you have resistance? That's a sign of a clan culture. Were you able to change your service lines very quickly? I see some organizations that were able to deploy their staff within a week. Others took several weeks or maybe still struggling to do so because there's more hierarchy. That hierarchy has been serving them for a reason, so we're not here to judge that. But when the market or the external environment changed so suddenly, really put a lot of pressure on them. And some organizations are able to respond differently than others. Before we go to questions, I'd like to just end with this quote from Deming. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So your organization culture has evolved over time from when your organization was new and probably was a startup, adhocracy type focused organization. We mature more into hierarchy, we mature into clan. We're being challenged to move in the direction of market with value-based reimbursement. And I want to say that this framework can help us to visualize what our gut is already telling us. At the conclusion of this program, when you're able to download these slides, I encourage you to print this out and reflect further, to purchase the book, Diagnosing and Changing Organizational Culture. If you're also interested in going into more depth, I also recommend this book by Edgar Schein. Many of you have read his book on helping or Humble Inquiry, which are, I think, well-known books in our helping professions. This is organizational culture and leadership. Well, the competing values framework is sort of a skeleton Shine's work is really the flesh and the muscle, and gives a lot more depth, and a really wonderful, wonderful resource. I encourage you to be strategic about your organizational change. And as we're doing strategic planning and moving towards any change in our organization, whether it's well planned or whether we're thrust into it, like we have with COVID-19, I think that the important thing is to consider being strategic and making incremental change. The authors will say, when we make a small change to culture, it's as much effort as making a large change. So let's be thoughtful with our resource, making small changes at a time, and being thoughtful about the resistance to change and what we're doing to the fabric. If you'd like to attend the breakout session that's following our break, we're going to be getting into general leadership strategies to changing culture. And so these are things that you can do as leaders, making any kind of cultural change. We're going to begin to explore some of those, and then we're going to spend some time in discussion, taking more of your questions. This breakout session is intended to be a little more interactive and more informal. And then we'll be talking about specific strategies for moving towards hierarchy, market, clan, or adhocracy. If you're wanting to be more nimble, particularly if you're a government-based organization or you're a more mature organization, we can talk about some tips for being more market-focused, more adhocracy-focused. And again, we'll go into more discussion.
Okay, Drew, thank you so much. That's fascinating every time I hear it. And so we have quite a few questions. So I'm going to start with one in the middle, not in order that they came in, because I'm curious what you're going to say. If you go back to that correlation with the center of power, where you have sort of your experience, there you go. Nope, where'd it go? Yeah. So someone asked, where would you put lawyers? There actually are quite a few attorneys who run behavioral health organizations. So that is an interesting question.
You know, this is also an interesting question to me, because when I look at physician-led practices and attorney-led practices, there are some similarities in that their governance structures are unique. Now, if I look at a law practice as an example, we've got a group of lawyers. We may have one person who's kind of an office manager or running the business operations, and then so we've got like owners who are also kind of followers. That's not the case here. We're talking about an attorney who is running the organization. I would say it depends on their experience, because lawyers who have been in a law office may be operating independently of each other, or they may be operating and used to being more in a partnership or running as teams. So I think it depends on their orientation of where they have perhaps practiced in the past and how they've been socialized to leadership. Was it operating in adhocracy or as a solo practitioner, or were people working as teams? Were they working in a government organization formally, and they might be tending to drive a little more adhocracy? So I think it's going to depend. It's going to be kind of all over the board like physicians are.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to jump into some of these questions. So as an example of a specific area of concern, such as impacting health disparities, what were some of the measures or strategies and outcomes that you found for assessing and addressing the values such as institutional racism that compete with equity and inclusion? So the question is really about when you're finding values that are competing with desired outcomes, What are you seeing in those kinds of organizations? And
I think we're always finding that balance. And what you're describing is the need for clan. I mean, we're really needing to be sensitive to the people that we serve, to the cultures, the diversity, the disparities, the inequities. And if we were market focused, we might not really care about that as much. However, as we look to be serving communities in a more effective way, our payers are expecting us from a reimbursement perspective to be more sensitive, to be more inclusive, to be addressing the whole population, not just picking and choosing the people that we want to serve. We may be responsible for a broader population and their needs in the community. So I think that there are market drivers that are actually asking us to be more sensitive. In a sense, we might be saying we're pulling in both directions, but we're trying to find that balance. But we've got to anchor in the clan. We've got to anchor in that sensitivity and understanding, working through our own stigmas as leaders and as clinicians, as staff, in order to serve groups of people.
okay, here's another. Do you think it's possible for, of course, we believe in recovery, anything is possible, but do you think it's possible for a large agency to change on a dime or revert to a different cultural model due to COVID? Because COVID is it's a crisis. Sometimes we're able to change a little better in crisis. What do you think about that one?
I think it's easier for smaller organizations. Let's look at a privately run organization. We'll look at a case study in the breakout session. They were able to turn on a dime and deploy their teams in a week because there's one leader who's making decisions, a few people pulling the triggers to make action steps, and it happens. In larger organizations, when we're making change, one thing I'm often emphasizing is let's pilot, let's try it in one area and then see how it works and then move to the rest of the organization. That's the ideal in a normal change circumstance. I think it's most effective when we can go to the front line, and we call this the microsystem, to go to the front line and say, how would you drive this change, clinicians and staff? How do you see this working? Making some change at a small, at maybe a service line, maybe a particular site, and then beginning to see if we can modify that and adapt it over the larger organization. That takes some time. In this type of situation, we've got to move quickly, but I would say maybe piloting is a good idea. We can kind of make some tweaks. We come up with a framework, but we allow the different service lines to adapt on their own because they may need to adapt differently. So instead of a top-down change initiative where senior leadership are saying, here's the change that's coming down the pike, it's setting up the strategic goals, setting up a model that may have been piloted at the local level, at the front line, and then allowing people the flexibility to adapt that into their own situations. It's inviting that innovation, which we might not have invited before. And if we've got a lot of bureaucracy or a lot of permissions, we're going to have to loosen the bolts a little bit. We see that with the states. Okay, we're relaxing some of the HIPAA and privacy regulations around telehealth. We may need to do that internally as well. We may have had a lot of rules, and we may need to say, we really need you to comply with these things, but these other elements of our policies and procedures we can let go of during this emergency. Make it work. Ask for forgiveness later instead of asking for permission.
My favorite. So one person made a comment which was really interesting, and it said you can have different sectors of the matrix be dominant within different departments of an organization. And that kind of speaks to some of the things that we spoke about and that you spoke about a little about subcultures. So I wonder if you could address that comment and maybe a little bit about what causes a subculture to form, and talk a little bit about how an agency can develop different, different parts of the matrix and different areas of the organization.
Certainly, we see subcultures at different sites, in different service lines, and that's going to be driven by professions, by the people that are served, because the people that we serve really influence and impact our culture as well. I remember earlier in my career, I was in college and working at a long-term psychiatric facility where I had on-the-job training, and I had worked in the evening shift. We worked 8-hour days in those days, so it was 4 to midnight. And at what point I moved to the day shift, and what a culture shock I had, moving from evenings, which were pretty relaxed, to the day shift where executive leaders were present and everybody followed the rules, and it was a lot more strict. So even the time of day that we're working can impact that. Different sites are going to have different subcultures based on their leaders, based on the people that they serve, as I mentioned, service lines based on the professions. We may have a medical oriented service line with a lot of nurses, which is going to be different than PhD psychologists, than peer support. So I think we're going to naturally see subcultures in every organization. We see it in manufacturing as well. We see the sales group in the skyscraper operating differently than the manufacturing that's happening out on the floor than we might see in the executive suite. So I think it's very much driven by the functions of the products or services that are in leadership.
Well, it's interesting because I'm gonna. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question of my own, and we still have another question from the group. But someone made a comment as you were talking, which said culture thing in several orgs. One area you see in residential, typically with less funding from the state, has a more constricted culture. Stress from the shortage of staff and low pay. Why can't the top levels seem to recognize this? And what I was going to ask was, change is always easiest when it comes from the top down. It just is, because you can, if you're the CEO, you can make policy, people have to follow it. But change occurs from sideways and from the bottom up. So, given kind of that comment, could you talk a little bit about, have you seen, or do you have some ideas about how some of the subcultures can change each other, or how we can begin to change from the bottom up, or how we influence each other in our subcultures to get where we want to go? Let's say the top isn't changing.
I think in our organizations, there is a drive to move from the left to the right, to be more innovative, to be more perhaps market focused. That's a general cultural driver. But from a quality improvement, process improvement, again, I see frontline teams who are driving innovations and then collaborating with each other, being more successful because there's more ownership and the change actually sticks. So I think people need to be allowed and given the space to be driving innovation, and that sometimes means a leader not being in the room, because people will defer to the executive leader and, we're going to be waiting for them to give us their words of wisdom, as opposed to letting staff and clinicians at the front line develop innovations and then cross-pollinate. That requires, though, that the leadership must have, those groups must have sponsorship, and that there's good sponsorship across the organization to drive that cross-pollination.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, another question, and I think we probably are going to wrap up. So what do you recommend to an organization which has become slow to adapt and unsympathetic to its customers?
So this is an organization that is slow to adapt and unsympathetic to its customers, and it's probably very dominant in hierarchy. And so we're going to be going in more depth on some of these change strategies, but we want to begin to do some innovations. We also want to be able to involve team members to perhaps be driving some of that change. And I think that we might want to be more centered on the people that we serve by involving them in our planning and our strategy. On the medical side, we've heard this term for years called patient-centered care, as opposed to an older model that was physician-centered. So the doctor was in the center, and we had people served kind of surrounding them along with staff. And then we're moving towards a model where we're saying, the person that's served is in the center. So I would ask, are we gathering data and feedback from the people that we serve? Are we including them in focus groups, in advisory panels, in a meaningful way, not just as an exercise, and getting information from them about how we can better serve them, both the people who are already in our system and the people who might be outside of our system waiting to be served as well. So I think a lot of that sensitivity comes from listening to the people that we serve and acting upon their concerns and recommendations. I've seen this in FQHCs for years. It's not just a one-time focus group, but successful organizations have that advisory panel function that's on an ongoing basis where they're putting their ear to the ground, and they may be doing a great job with listening to the needs of people served, but there's changes occurring out in the environment that leaders may not even know about. So that advisory panel model can help to inform and update leaders on dynamics that are occurring.
Right. Yeah. You know, change is all around us. It never stops, and if we don't embrace it, it can eat us for breakfast. So so I think that's very important. I'd like you all to join me in thanking Drew DiGiovanni for a really stimulating and interesting and well thought out presentation, and then join us at 11:30. 11:45 on the link that's on your screen. I think that's why Len has come back on to tell you how to get back on. So go ahead, Len. You want to do that?
Thank you, Edie.
And then I'll just give you one more word at the end.
Just want to remind folks that at 11:45, the 2 workshops begin. And to get to your room, you need to go to the NYAPRS website, which is www.nyaprs.org. And on the left-hand bottom of your screen, there's information about the seminar. You'll click on May 5th, which is today, and you will find your program there. And in your program, underneath the workshop that you wish to attend is the link to the room.
Right. So thank you, Len. So both this afternoon's workshops are wonderful. They'll both be recorded, so you won't miss anything if you go to one or the other. But if you want to get a little bit more into using this matrix and talking about some change in your organization and how to move it along, come join us at that link. And again, thanks so much to Drew for joining us today early in the morning, because he's on the West Coast, so or almost on the West Coast. And so have a nice break, everybody. Thanks again, Drew, and we will get back together again at 11:45.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.